It's strange, isn't it? How a civilization so obsessed with memory could allow something so massive, so staggering, so elaborate to vanish almost completely from history. The ancient Egyptians etched their deeds in stone. They mummified bodies to preserve them for eternity. They built monuments to withstand the floods of time. And yet, somewhere beneath the desert near Hawara, just south of the pyramid fields of Giza, lies a ruin that once astonished even the Greeks, a structure said to surpass the Great Pyramid in grandeur. Today, almost no one remembers it. This is the labyrinth. Not a myth, not a metaphor, at least not at first. Herodotus, the famed Greek traveller, claimed to have seen it with his own eyes. It surpasses even the pyramids, he wrote in the 5th century BCE, detailing its 12 courts, its interlocking rooms, its endless corridors, all so confusing that even those familiar with it would struggle to find their way. Yet oddly, despite his fame and the boldness of his claims, many modern textbooks omit this marvel entirely. How could something so astonishing simply vanish? That's where our story begins, not with what we know, but with what we've forgotten. But before we descend into the shifting sands and silent chambers, before we pull away the veil that time has drawn over these sun-baked ruins, take a moment to help this strange little expedition grow. If you like this kind of storytelling, these slow spirals into deep history, then maybe, just maybe, hit like and subscribe. But only if you truly enjoy it. And tell me, what time is it where you are? What corner of the world are you falling asleep in tonight? Now, back to the sand. A few miles from the green ribbon of the Nile near the ruins of the ancient city of Crocodilopolis. Yes, that's the real name. Sits a flat, dry plain. Nothing remarkable, just dirt and dust, a few scattered stone blocks, maybe some broken pottery here and there. But underneath, like a body buried without a grave marker, lies something far older than the Roman Empire, older than Greece, something that once drew emperors, philosophers, and priests across the desert. It's believed to have been constructed during the reign of Amenemhat III, a pharaoh of the 12th dynasty, roughly 1850 BCE. That alone is a historical fact worth pausing on. Amenemhat III was no minor king. His reign marked the height of Middle Kingdom power. Under his rule, Egypt was stable, rich, and ambitious. And what do ambitious pharaohs do? They build. But this wasn't just another pyramid, another tomb stuffed with gold. According to ancient accounts, the labyrinth was a ceremonial complex unlike anything else in Egypt, or anywhere else on Earth. Some say it held 12 great courts, roofed with stone slabs, all linked by twisting corridors. Others describe shrines to every major deity, housed together in a symbolic unity that had never been seen before. If true, it would mean this place was more than a temple. It was a map of Egypt's soul, and yet, despite all that grandeur, no obvious ruins remain. No proud colonnades, no pillars of stone, no surviving inscriptions announcing its builder's name. You'd expect such a structure to leave a scar on the land. But here, silence. So why is it forgotten? Why do our museums fill shelves with canopic jars and golden jewellery, but rarely mention this enigma? Some historians blame the lack of physical evidence. Others point out that later travellers may have exaggerated or misunderstood what they saw. And of course, some whisper of darker reasons, of knowledge deliberately buried, of stories quietly erased. Because the labyrinth, by its very design, wasn't meant to be easy to understand. And it's not just Herodotus. Later writers, like Diodorus, Siculus, and Strabo, also described the labyrinth, each one painting a slightly different picture, each one convinced of its overwhelming scale. The descriptions conflict in the details but converge in one haunting truth. They were all deeply affected by what they saw. Curiously, not all descriptions agree on whether the labyrinth was above ground or below. Some place it beneath the surface, a hidden underworld of rituals and secrets. Others describe open courtyards, blazing in the Egyptian sun. Perhaps both are true. Perhaps the surface structure has long since vanished, stripped away by looters and floodwaters, while the real heart of the labyrinth sleeps underneath, untouched and waiting. And while Egyptologists have indeed identified a site beneath the pyramid of Amenemhat III at Hawara as the most likely location, excavation has been strangely minimal. Partial digs in the 19th and early 20th centuries uncovered walls and passageways, but never the vast, coiling maze described by the ancients. Was it destroyed? Or are we simply looking in the wrong direction? You might be wondering how such a colossal structure could vanish so thoroughly. But keep in mind, entire temples have been swallowed by rising water tables. Sandstorms can bury cities in weeks. And when conquerors need building materials, the ruins of old gods become very useful quarries. Oddly enough, crocodiles may have had a hand in this mystery too. The region was sacred to Sobek, the crocodile god of power and fertility. The nearby town of Crocodilopolis was a centre of worship where sacred reptiles were fed honey cakes and embalmed after death. Historians are still debating whether the presence of these beasts was symbolic or practical. Some suggest the labyrinth may have doubled as a centre for Sobek's worship, with living crocodiles swimming in its subterranean canals. Imagine trying to explore a flooded stone corridor while a dozen sacred reptiles lurked in the shadows. Even now, the land around Hawara is waterlogged. The water table is high, the ruins slowly sinking. Some archaeologists have reported underground chambers filled with water. Others dismiss those claims as wishful thinking. But water, in Egyptian cosmology, wasn't just an inconvenience. It was the symbol of the primeval chaos from which life emerged. It was the border between worlds. Perhaps the labyrinth wasn't just hidden by time, but by design. Perhaps it was meant to be returned to the waters that gave birth to creation. So where does that leave us? Somewhere between memory and myth, between dry records and wild speculation. The labyrinth's existence is attested by ancient eyewitnesses. Its supposed location aligns with the remains of Amenemhat III's pyramid complex. But what it truly was, temple, tomb, museum, or something else entirely, remains unresolved. And maybe that's why it endures, in whispers, in dreams, in the quiet speculation of those still willing to look past the sand. He arrived dusty, sunburnt, and likely a little overwhelmed. Herodotus, the so-called father of history, was many things: a traveller, a storyteller, a collector of rumours. He wandered through the ancient world, gathering tales like seashells, arranging them into the first real attempt at a historical narrative. And somewhere around the 5th century BCE, he found himself in Egypt, a foreigner, a Greek among gods carved in stone. What he saw in Egypt astonished him. He wrote of pyramids that confounded logic, priests who claimed a lineage 10,000 years old, and statues larger than city gates. But of all his observations, none was more glowing, or more haunting, than his account of the labyrinth. It was located, he said, just beyond the lake of Moeris, known today as Birket Karun, near the city of Arsinoe. He described 12 covered courts, evenly divided between north and south, surrounded by endless chambers and twisting passageways. The floors and ceilings were of polished stone, the walls etched with elaborate carvings, the roofs composed of immense slabs as large as the stones used in the pyramids. Beneath the main level, he claimed, lay a subterranean complex of equal scale, one that no guide dared show him. Herodotus said he saw it himself, not just heard about it, not merely recorded a legend, but walked through its echoing halls. Was he lying? Historians are still debating whether Herodotus exaggerated for effect or whether his Egyptian host staged something specially for him. It wouldn't be the first time a visiting foreigner was shown a curated version of reality. After all, tourism is one of the oldest industries in the Nile Valley. And Herodotus was known to embellish. He spoke of giant ants in India and phoenixes in Egypt. He enjoyed a good tale, but even he seemed almost unable to find words for the labyrinth. "Words are insufficient," he wrote. "It surpasses all description." That's not something he said lightly. Curiously, he spent less time describing the architectural layout than the feeling it gave him. The sheer confusion, the sense of deliberate mystery. He spoke of being led through halls that always seemed to turn in on themselves, a corridor that opened into another, then another. One wrong step and you'd be utterly lost. Was it a temple, a fortress, a ceremonial maze for spiritual trial? He never said. He did, however, say that beneath the labyrinth were crypts that held the tombs of kings and sacred crocodiles. Now, there's an odd fact. We know crocodiles were venerated at certain temples, especially in the Fayum region. Mummified crocodiles have been found in tombs, buried with jewellery, even given names. But the idea of housing crocodiles in underground tombs, directly beneath a vast ceremonial structure, is strange even by ancient Egyptian standards. It suggests that the structure above wasn't simply for worship or burial. It may have been an interface, a threshold between the world of the living and something darker, wetter, and far more primordial. Other ancient writers, perhaps inspired by Herodotus or drawing from the same Egyptian sources, echo his awe. Strabo, writing centuries later, also visited the site. His description includes large columns and numerous courts, but unlike Herodotus, he notes that the roof had already collapsed. This indicates that by the Roman era, the labyrinth was already falling into ruin. Why didn't the Egyptians themselves preserve it more carefully? That's another point of curiosity. The Egyptians were meticulous in recording their architectural triumphs. We know the dimensions of temples that are long gone. We have floor plans etched into stone, instructions on ritual movement, even worker rosters carved on quarry walls. And yet, about the labyrinth, so vast, so sacred, so unforgettable, we find almost nothing in surviving Egyptian records. No inscriptions, no dedicatory plaques, no clear mention in the hieroglyphic texts unearthed so far. It's almost as if they deliberately avoided writing about it. Or perhaps what they did write was hidden, or lost, or buried like the structure itself. Some believe the labyrinth belonged to a priestly caste, not to the royal household. That it may have served as a kind of initiation chamber for mystery schools, ancient esoteric institutions that trained selected individuals in secret knowledge. If true, this could explain the silence. Such societies were known to avoid permanent written records, preferring oral transmission and encoded symbols. It also aligns eerily well with Herodotus's own claim, that the guides refused to show him the lower levels, a forbidden floor, a sacred substructure. It sounds like the stuff of fiction, and yet, you begin to see the pattern, don't you? Every piece of evidence is like a breadcrumb dropped in the sand. A traveller's account here, a collapsed column there, a map half burned, a rumour of tunnels. The labyrinth exists at the edge of knowability, too well documented to be myth, too elusive to be fully accepted as fact. And that's where things get even more tangled. Because Herodotus, whether a liar, a dreamer, or the last eyewitness to something truly astonishing, set the tone for every future exploration. Those who came after him were either chasing his ghost or trying to prove him wrong. His words created a puzzle no one has solved, and perhaps he knew that would happen. Perhaps that was the point. Did he suspect he'd seen only a shadow of something older? Was he being deceived, or was he simply describing the indescribable? We'll likely never know. But there's something poetic, even mischievous, about a historian whose most dramatic claim remains unconfirmed. It suits the labyrinth, this thing of angles and echoes built to baffle. Even its history is designed to fold back on itself to leave you turning in circles. Still, the record is there. Herodotus, 5th century BCE, 12 courts, endless chambers, sacred crocodiles, tombs beneath, and a deep sense of awe. He left us that much. And sometimes, the stories that endure aren't the ones carved in stone, but the ones whispered, half-believed, into a dusty journal by a sunburnt traveller who swore he saw something no one else could quite explain. If you've ever tried to piece together a puzzle where the pieces came from different boxes, you'll understand what it feels like to study ancient texts about the Egyptian labyrinth. Herodotus was only the beginning. He may have walked through the halls himself, or simply walked through someone else's memory, but others came after him, equally curious, equally baffled. Strabo, the Greek geographer and philosopher, visited Egypt around the turn of the 1st century BCE. Like Herodotus, he left us a description of the labyrinth, but curiously the details don't line up. According to Strabo, the structure was still partially standing, though damaged. He mentioned a roofless ruin of immense scale, with halls and columns of astonishing workmanship. He added that the building was situated beside a pyramid, likely the one at Hawara, which we now associate with Amenemhat III. So far, so good. But then Strabo mentioned something odd. He claims the structure had 27 shrines inside, not 12 courts. That's not a minor error. It suggests either a different building, a different measurement, or, most intriguingly, a different purpose. Then there's Diodorus Siculus, writing just a few decades after Strabo. He echoes some of the earlier details, grand architecture, vast complexity, but adds a new twist. He says the labyrinth was built by King Mendes to serve as his tomb. There's just one problem. No such pharaoh exists in the traditional Egyptian king lists. The name could be a corruption of Amenemhat, or even of Mentuhotep. or it could be entirely invented. And so, we find ourselves tangled in the weeds of ancient translation. These were Greek and Roman travellers, after all, outsiders peering into a civilization already thousands of years old. They couldn't read hieroglyphs. They relied on local guides, most of whom spoke later dialects. Every piece of information they received had passed through multiple tongues, cultures, and centuries. Imagine trying to describe the New York Public Library to someone in the year 6000, using only second-hand stories told by tourists who couldn't read English. The result is chaos. Still, there are clues. Strabo placed the labyrinth near a canal system used for irrigation, with a nearby artificial lake, likely Birket Karun. That matches Herodotus. Diodorus mentions vast stone blocks, assembled without mortar, forming the walls of the structure. Again, this matches what we know about Middle Kingdom engineering, but then Pliny the Elder enters the picture. Pliny never visited Egypt himself. His natural history, written in the 1st century CE, compiles many older sources, some credible, some less so. He writes that the labyrinth was built to confuse enemies, filled with traps and illusions. He also claimed that it inspired Daedalus to create the Greek labyrinth of Minos, the one where the Minotaur lived. Here, the legend begins to split. On one path, we have historical accounts, flawed, yes, but grounded in real observations. On the other, myth creeps in. The Egyptian labyrinth becomes the prototype of all later labyrinths, including those of myth. Some scholars suggest the Greek concept of a labyrinth as a place of trials, transformation, and confrontation may have borrowed more from Egyptian mysticism than we'd like to admit. But again, historians are still debating whether the Greek labyrinth myth predates or follows the Egyptian model. Chicken or egg, Daedalus or Amenemhat. The word labyrinth itself is Greek, labyrinthos, and may have derived from a pre-Greek word associated with double axes and ceremonial mazes. There's no direct Egyptian word that matches it. Egyptians had temples, tombs, and perank, houses of life, which were educational and spiritual centres. But a labyrinth? That's a foreign lens. A Greek attempt to describe something they couldn't quite define, and perhaps that's the problem. The more you translate an enigma, the more it slips between languages. Let's pause for a moment here and consider something off-topic, though not entirely unrelated. In 1905, a Dutch scholar named Pieter van der Meer de Walcheren published a long poem called Le Labyrinthe d'Egypte, based entirely on Herodotus' account. In it, the labyrinth becomes a dream, a trap for the soul. He writes of mirrored halls, where memory itself twists and dissolves. It's a romantic fantasy, yes, but it captures something many scholars overlook. The labyrinth was never just about architecture. It was about disorientation. It was a ritual of confusion, and that confusion continues today. One modern archaeologist may point to a crumbled foundation and say, "Here it stood." Another may dismiss the entire thing as a misinterpreted, mortuary temple. A third might claim the real structure is still underground, untouched, sleeping beneath layers of silt and silence. And then there are the literal misreadings. One early translator mistook the word labyrinthos for lapidarium, a stone quarry. This led to a century of confusion, where scholars debated whether the whole structure was simply a workshop for shaping stones. Others have suggested the labyrinth was a nickname for a larger city, perhaps an ancient district of Crocodilopolis or Hawara itself. Some even claim it wasn't a building at all, but a way of describing an administrative system, where different courts or departments mirrored each other in a bureaucratic maze. It's a compelling theory. The Egyptians did love symmetry. Their temples were aligned with stars, their myths with calendars. Perhaps the labyrinth was an embodiment of social order, written in stone, and yet, no matter how many rational explanations emerge, the legend persists. Why? Maybe because it taps into something older than Egypt, the fear of being lost, the idea that knowledge must be earned through confusion, that the path to understanding wins through halls of doubt and repetition. Even today, mazes appear in spiritual traditions as tools for meditation. Walking a labyrinth isn't about getting somewhere. It's about getting lost and returning changed. So perhaps the Greeks were onto something, even if they didn't understand what they saw. Perhaps the labyrinth was a structure and a metaphor. Perhaps it was built to embody the disorientation one must endure to reach the sacred. But one thing is certain. When the ancient writers spoke of the labyrinth, they were not all describing the same thing. They brought their own cultures, languages, and expectations into Egypt, and what they saw was filtered through those lenses. The courts became shrines, the shrines became prisons, the halls became myths, the myths became symbols, and somewhere, beneath it all, was a real place, or is. You could stand right on top of it and never know it was there. In the late 1800s, long after Herodotus, Strabo and the rest had faded into dusty footnotes, a French Egyptologist named Edouard Naville went searching for the labyrinth. He wasn't chasing myths or indulging in fantasies. He was a scientist, a man of order and reason, backed by the Egypt Exploration Fund and driven by the hard edge of academic method. What he found, however, only deepened the mystery. Naville was working near the pyramid of Amenemhat III at Hawara, exactly where Herodotus said the labyrinth should be. He dug, sifted, measured, and carefully documented his findings, and yes, he uncovered ruins, foundations, columns, courtyards. There were rooms, walls, doorways, but there was no sign of anything like the immense structure Herodotus described. No vast courts, no endless passageways, just fragments, broken stones, bits of carved granite, a jumbled skeleton of something that once had bones. Still, what Naville found matched enough of the ancient descriptions to convince him, and others, that this was the site. The problem was scale. The ruins were far too modest, far too damaged. If this was truly the labyrinth, then most of it had vanished, or perhaps more accurately had never been above ground to begin with. This is where things get interesting. Naville noted something peculiar. The water table was unusually high. The area around Hawara was soggy, the ruins partly submerged. Digging deeper became difficult, even dangerous. His team eventually had to stop. They had barely scratched the surface. Years later, in 1911, a young archaeologist named Flinders Petrie returned to the site. Petrie was something of a rebel, a man who scoffed at treasure hunters and insisted on precise, systematic excavation. He too found fragments, beautiful ones, delicate carvings, colourful columns, pieces of alabaster so fine they caught the light like glass. He discovered that many of the stones had been removed in antiquity, stripped away and reused in later buildings, and that may explain part of the mystery. By the Roman period, the labyrinth was already in decline. As Egypt shifted from native rule to foreign domination, its great monuments were pillaged for their materials. Petrie recorded that thousands of cubic meters of stone were missing from the site. It was as if a cathedral had been carefully disassembled and scattered across the landscape. Pillars became foundation stones. Ceiling blocks became bridges. The labyrinth, once vast and echoing, had been quietly dismantled and reused piece by piece. And yet, something wasn't right. Even accounting for the missing stones, the layout didn't add up. There were no signs of the 12 courts, no underground chambers, no twisting maze. Petrie believed that the structure had mostly been built of mud brick, which dissolves quickly in wet conditions. Perhaps that explained the gaps. Perhaps the grand labyrinth had been humbler than described. A trick of exaggeration, a misremembered monument, but not everyone agreed. Historians are still debating whether the visible ruins at Hawara are the remains of the labyrinth itself, or simply the tip of a far greater structure buried below. In the early 2000s, a new group of researchers returned to the site, this time with technology the ancients could never dream of: ground-penetrating radar. The Matahar expedition, led by Louis de Cordier, used non-invasive techniques to scan beneath the sand. What they found was astonishing. Beneath the visible ruins lies something enormous, a grid of cavities, massive hollow spaces, straight lines and angular corners stretching out under the desert floor, and yet, despite the findings, the team was denied further excavation. The data was never formally published in an academic journal. Egypt's Supreme Council of Antiquities, then headed by Zahi Hawass, argued that the findings were inconclusive. No digging followed, no confirmation came, and so, once again, the labyrinth slipped back into silence. Why would something so potentially explosive be buried in bureaucracy? That's a question no one seems eager to answer. There are rumours, of course, whispers of discoveries that are too politically sensitive, too spiritually dangerous, or too disruptive to the existing narrative. But such ideas live mostly in the realm of speculation. What we know for certain is this: beneath the sands of Hawara, there is something large, structured, and unnatural. And that's not just wishful thinking. Even today, archaeologists struggle to excavate in that region. The water rises quickly, the sand is unstable, and the area is surrounded by farmland and modern settlements, making large-scale digs costly and controversial. It's an odd fate for something that once rivaled the pyramids in fame. Or perhaps that's the point. Perhaps the labyrinth wasn't destroyed. Perhaps it was never truly exposed. Perhaps the visible ruins are a kind of mirage, a shallow outer shell, while the true labyrinth, with its 12 courts, its confusing corridors and its sunken tombs, lies waiting below, intact and forgotten. Oddly, there's a modern comparison. In 1961, American archaeologists discovered the buried city of Akrotiri on the Greek island of Santorini. It had been completely hidden beneath volcanic ash for over 3,000 years, perfectly preserved, untouched, a snapshot in time. What if the labyrinth is the same? A structure so well hidden, so deeply buried, that it awaits not the explorer, but the right moment. A time when the tools, the politics, and the curiosity finally align. Until then, we're left with fragments, stone chips, partial floor plans, descriptions written by men whose bones are now dust. But still we search. Because the idea of the labyrinth, a place of order buried beneath chaos, speaks to something deep in the human mind. A longing to uncover what's been hidden, to make sense of the maze, even if it means digging through centuries of sand. The desert sun bakes the land around Hawara, where low reeds bend in the breeze and irrigation canals crisscross like veins of a forgotten body. It's hard to imagine now, but this arid expanse was once the cradle of something sacred and something strangely reptilian. In ancient Egypt, crocodiles were more than feared predators. They were gods. The region of the Fayum, home to the city once known as Shedet, later renamed Crocodilopolis by the Greeks, was devoted to Sobek, the crocodile god. Sobek was no minor deity. He was a god of strength, fertility and protection, closely linked to the Nile's life-giving power. But he was also a god of chaos, capable of destruction and terror. The crocodile's dual nature, nurturing and murderous, made Sobek both beloved and feared. It is here, in this sacred marshland, that the labyrinth was built. Coincidence? Hardly. The pyramid of Amenemhat III rises near the edge of Birket Karun, once thought to be a natural lake, but in fact an enormous artificial basin engineered in ancient times. The pyramid itself is unimpressive by Egyptian standards, weathered, collapsed in places, worn down by centuries. But it was once surrounded by something far more mysterious, a sprawling complex of shrines, halls, and chambers, the labyrinth. Why here? Why not build it closer to the major religious centres of Memphis or Thebes? Historians are still debating whether the choice of Hawara was practical, spiritual, or both. But many now believe the site's sacred connection to Sobek played a key role. According to legend, a single crocodile was kept in a sacred pond near the labyrinth. This beast, named Petsuchos by the Greeks, was adorned with gold earrings and precious stones, fed honey cakes, and revered by pilgrims. When it died, it was embalmed and replaced with a new crocodile, who took on the same name, the same rituals, the same divine identity. In death, the god was reborn. That alone is strange. But there's more. Archaeologists have discovered underground chambers near Hawara filled with mummified crocodiles. Not just a handful, hundreds. Some wrapped in fine linen, some buried in mass graves, some placed in wooden coffins carved to resemble their shape. The implication is clear. Crocodile worship was not a fringe cult, it was mainstream. What if the labyrinth wasn't just a temple for the dead pharaoh, but also a house of Sobek? What if the twisting corridors were meant to mimic the winding canals of the Fayum, the twisting body of the Nile, or even the serpentine path of the crocodile itself? There's something poetic about that idea. A labyrinth designed not for humans, but for a god who swims instead of walks. And yet this spiritual association introduces an unsettling possibility. Crocodiles were known to roam the canals of the Fayum, especially in the flood season. Is it possible that live crocodiles were released into certain sections of the labyrinth, turning it into a literal trial of survival? It sounds absurd. But so did sacred honey cakes and gold jewellery for a crocodile, until they were found buried alongside the animals, and there's an even odder detail. A Roman-era papyrus speaks of a hall of Sobek hidden beneath the temple complex at Hawara. No coordinates, no map, just a phrase, a name, the Hall of Sobek. Was it metaphorical, a poetic title for a shrine? Or was it a real chamber, buried beneath the sand, flooded now with dark water, and watched over by silent mummies of scaly gods? If you think that sounds like fantasy, you're not alone. Most mainstream historians avoid these threads, preferring to focus on architecture, logistics, and stone. But the ancient Egyptians didn't separate religion from infrastructure. A canal was a god. A gate was a ritual. A crocodile was a bridge between worlds. The labyrinth wasn't just stone, it was symbolism. It was the materialization of myth. Even Amenemhat III's choice of location supports this. During his reign, he undertook massive waterworks projects in the Fayum, improving irrigation and stabilizing the region's economy. He was the crocodile pharaoh in more ways than one. Some statues even show him with Sobek's features: crocodilian eyes, wide jaws, a serene gaze that seems to say, "I understand the waters beneath the world." His pyramid at Hawara was the first in Egypt to feature a subterranean burial chamber, with multiple false paths and blocked corridors, a miniature labyrinth beneath the king's eternal house. Was this design influenced by Sobek's nature? A maze meant to confound, protect, and devour those who trespassed? There's a chilling beauty to it. Even today, when modern explorers walk the site at Hawara, they report strange occurrences. A sudden rise in water levels, tools gone missing, shadows in photographs. Locals tell stories of cursed stones, haunted pathways, whispers at night. Of course, none of this holds up in court, but then, neither does the smell of incense or the tremble in your chest when you walk into an ancient place that still remembers being sacred. Even stranger, an off-topic fact but a compelling one. NASA satellite imaging has detected thermal anomalies beneath the Hawara complex, small hot spots in otherwise cool terrain. Some believe this is due to decaying organic matter, others suspect volcanic activity. A few whisper about underground chambers generating heat from sealed biological processes. No consensus, just data, waiting. So here we are, a pyramid that hides instead of flaunts, a temple that floods instead of soars, a king who honoured a crocodile, a god who swam in holy canals, a place where stone and spirit twisted into a maze designed not to be walked, but endured. Whether or not crocodiles still swim beneath the sands of Hawara, their presence is felt. In the silence, in the stillness, in the way scholars avert their gaze when asked about the flooded lower chambers. And maybe that's the real secret of the labyrinth. It wasn't designed to trap the body, it was built to unsettle the soul. What does symmetry mean to a civilization that worshipped the sun, the stars, and the balance of cosmic order? In Egypt, symmetry wasn't just pleasing to the eye, it was sacred. Every line, every measurement, every mirrored column echoed the mythological balance between chaos and order, life and death, east and west. The entire world was seen as a reflection of Maat, the divine principle of harmony. And nowhere was this obsession with balance more clearly expressed than in the supposed design of the labyrinth. 12 courts, laid out in perfect proportion. According to Herodotus, there were 6 courts on the north, 6 on the south, all roofed with immense slabs of stone, aligned in such a way that they mirrored each other like twin reflections on the surface of a still pool. The sheer size and precision of the design left him speechless, so much so that, for once, he avoided his usual flair for the dramatic and simply declared it superior to even the pyramids. But were these courts real? Historians are still debating whether Herodotus exaggerated the number, misunderstood his guides, or accurately described something now lost beneath the ground. Flinders Petrie, during his excavations in the early 20th century, discovered foundational walls and hints of grand chambers, but he couldn't reconstruct the full floor plan. Too much had been stripped away, eroded, repurposed. Still, the tantalizing remains of large courtyards and corridors seem to confirm that something immense once stood there. One theory suggests the 12 courts represented the 12 nomes of Egypt, the regional divisions of the kingdom. Each court might have been dedicated to one nome's gods, governors, and rituals, forming a symbolic map of the nation itself, a stone representation of the body politic. Imagine walking through Egypt, not across land, but through space arranged in architectural metaphor. Each chamber a miniature province, guarded by stone lions or crocodiles, hung with banners, filled with offerings, a nation distilled into geometry. Another theory proposes the courts had an astronomical function. 12 courts, 12 months. Could the labyrinth have acted as a kind of calendar temple, used to track the progress of the year? The Egyptians were accomplished astronomers. They built temples aligned with solstices and equinoxes, with star risings and lunar cycles. Perhaps each court corresponded to a zodiacal sign, or to a segment of the Egyptian civil calendar. And here, another odd fact emerges. Fragments of ceiling stones found at Hawara are inscribed with star charts. Real ones, not just decorative. These maps show deacons and celestial figures used in Egyptian timekeeping. Not enough survives to reconstruct the entire ceiling, but what remains is suggestive. This wasn't a tomb, it was a machine made of stone ticking away the movements of the sky. The very word court might be misleading. We think of open spaces, flagstones, sunlit columns, but the ancient descriptions suggest these spaces were roofed. Herodotus even specifies that the ceilings were formed by single slabs of stone, some so large they rivaled the blocks used in the pyramids. No modern machinery could have moved such stones easily. How did they do it? Some archaeologists argue that the slabs were quarried locally and dragged using rollers, lubricated with Nile silt. Others suggest they used inclined planes and coordinated labour crews, pulling in harmony. There's a famous image from the tomb of Jehuti-Hotep that shows over 170 men pulling a single statue. With enough time and coordination, such feats were possible, but still, there's something about 12 monolithic roofs resting in symmetrical rows that strains the imagination. More intriguing is the function of these courts. Were they for ritual, for government, for storage? The lack of inscriptions leaves everything open. A few blocks show cartouches, but none provide detailed explanations. No list of ceremonies, no agenda for the priesthood, just fragments. And then there's the matter of the subterranean duplicate. According to Herodotus, beneath the 12 courts lay another level, just as vast, just as symmetrical, a mirror world. But he wasn't allowed to see it. His guides refused. They told him the lower level contained the tombs of the kings and the sacred crocodiles, too holy for foreign eyes. This idea, a double labyrinth, one above, one below, is both exciting and troubling. Why build two identical structures, one buried beneath the other? Perhaps the upper labyrinth represented the world of the living, and the lower one the world of the dead, a symbolic descent into the underworld. The 12 upper courts could symbolize the passage of the sun through the hours of the day, while the lower 12 marked its journey through the night. This would fit neatly into Egyptian cosmology, where the sun god Ra sails across the sky by day and through the Duat, the underworld, by night, reborn each morning. In this view, the labyrinth wasn't just an architectural marvel, it was a cosmological map, and it gets stranger. In 2008, ground-penetrating radar scans conducted by the Matahar expedition revealed subsurface anomalies beneath Hawara, rectangular voids, arranged in grid-like patterns, roughly aligning with the labyrinth's supposed dimensions. These anomalies were never officially excavated, and the findings were quietly shelved. Some argue the formations are natural cavities, others see them as promising signs of buried architecture. Still others whisper of suppression. Why hasn't Egypt allowed deeper digging? Water is the official reason. The water table is too high. Digging would risk flooding, and indeed much of the area is swampy even today. But some suspect there are other motives, political, religious, even nationalistic. After all, a find of this scale would overshadow every other monument in the country. It would require rewriting the guidebooks, and perhaps more uncomfortably it would prove Herodotus right. For centuries his account has been treated with skepticism. If he's vindicated, what other wild claims might deserve a second look? And so the 12 courts remain theoretical, but the idea won't go away. Like the hours on a clock, they tick around the edge of our understanding. 12 openings, 12 shadows, 12 reasons to keep looking. Because beneath the broken stones and beneath even the earth something lingers. A rhythm, a shape, a design too precise to be accidental. You can almost hear it if you close your eyes. Stone doors, swinging slowly, in the dark. They say the greatest secrets are hidden in plain sight, and at Hawara, the secret lies directly beneath the feet of a pharaoh. Amenemhat III's pyramid, a crumbling structure of weathered limestone and crumbling brick, sits like a forgotten elder among more famous pyramids. It lacks the grandeur of Giza, the perfection of Sneferu's Red Pyramid, or the precision of Djoser's Step Monument. But in many ways, Amenemhat's pyramid is far stranger. Because while most pyramids reach upward, this one seems to look down into the sand, into the water, into the earth's hidden chambers, and beneath it, legend says, lies the heart of the labyrinth. When Petrie and Naville surveyed the site in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, they noted something strange about the pyramid's substructure. Unlike most Old Kingdom pyramids, which featured straightforward burial chambers, the interior of Amenemhat's pyramid was a maze of narrow corridors, false passages and dead ends. Some corridors led nowhere. Some simply stopped, blocked by heavy slabs of stone. A few twisted back toward the entrance, as if to disorient and deceive. It wasn't elegant. It was confusing. Which in this context might have been the point. Was the pyramid itself a microcosm of the larger labyrinth complex? A condensed version of the chaos below? Or did it serve as the gateway, a symbolic plug to seal what lay beneath? Historians are still debating whether the pyramid and the labyrinth were conceived together or built in phases. Some argue that the labyrinth predated the pyramid. Others suggest the pyramid was built first and the surrounding complex grew around it. The lack of clear inscriptions or builders' notes, normally so abundant in Egyptian projects, leaves a blank in the record. But this blank isn't empty. It's waiting. A 2008 survey using ground-penetrating radar showed a massive rectilinear grid beneath the complex. Large, flat spaces, angular patterns, the kind of symmetry that nature doesn't produce. The scan revealed anomalies that suggested man-made chambers several meters below the surface, directly beneath the pyramid's footprint and fanning outward into the sands. And then, quietly, the project was halted. No excavation followed. No official statement. The images exist, but they float in scientific limbo, unverified, unrefuted, as if the desert had whispered and then closed its lips again. It's worth noting something peculiar here. Egyptian tombs were designed to be eternal, but not always accessible. Many were sealed, not with the hope of being visited, but to ensure their contents remained undisturbed. The idea of a burial complex being deliberately buried, flooded and forgotten fits neatly into this worldview. It might not be that the labyrinth has disappeared, it might be exactly where it was always meant to be, sealed under sand, stone and stories. There's a deeply unsettling logic to that. What better way to protect sacred knowledge than to hide it in plain sight? Beneath the monument of a king, where no one would dare dig? What better way to honour a god like Sobek, lord of the deep, than to place his temple beneath waterlogged earth? The Egyptians believed in thresholds, in liminal spaces, doorways between worlds. The Nile wasn't just a river, it was a spine of divinity, separating east from west, life from death. The desert was not just sand, but the land beyond order, and the underworld, Duat, was not merely below, it was beneath the known. Perhaps the labyrinth was never meant to be seen. Perhaps it was meant to be sensed, felt, suspected, heard in the quiet thud of a stone falling into a deep, wet chamber beneath the sand. In 1920, a team briefly attempted to excavate beneath the pyramid's northern base. They reported finding a staircase descending toward what appeared to be an antechamber, but the walls were unstable. Water seeped through the stone, equipment rusted overnight. The team was pulled out after 2 weeks and no further digging occurred. The report was quietly archived. And yet, stories persist. Locals speak of deep vibrations felt at night, of sounds beneath the earth, of water that rises too quickly in certain places with no clear source, of animals refusing to cross certain thresholds. These stories are easily dismissed. Superstitions, the residue of ancient awe. But they point to something consistent, an awareness that the land remembers. And then there's the question of access. If the labyrinth lies beneath the pyramid, how would one enter? Not through the front, clearly. That's long collapsed. Not through the base either, where heavy water pressure and structural risk make digging nearly impossible. But perhaps, just perhaps, there's another entrance. A hidden shaft, a passage buried beneath a different mound, a different ruin, a forgotten keyhole in the desert's skin. There's precedent. In 2015, a hidden door was discovered in the Great Pyramid of Giza. a chamber sealed off by centuries of rubble, unnoticed by previous generations of scholars. It was found only with modern scanning technology. Could the same be true at Hawara? Could the entrance to the labyrinth lie beneath a farmer's field, or a modern road, or a shallow pond? If it does, time may be running out. The water table in the region is rising. Climate shifts and irrigation projects have changed the landscape. Salt seeping into the stone accelerates erosion. Whatever remains of the labyrinth may be dissolving as you listen, quietly, relentlessly, and that more than anything gives the silence a kind of urgency. You can feel it, can't you? That tug behind the ribs, that whisper behind your ear, the knowledge that something enormous and unsolved lies just a few meters below the soles of your feet. The thought that a king built his house upon a secret so vast it swallowed entire centuries, beneath Amenemhat III's pyramid, beneath his feet, beneath our doubts, beneath the noise, there may still lie a structure built to outlast memory itself, a temple not to be seen, but to be dreamed. Imagine this. You've made it through the arid winds of the desert, crossed the lush edge of the Fayum, and now stand before a crumbling entrance beneath the eye of the sun. Dust swirls in lazy spirals around your feet. The doorway ahead opens into shadow, cool and beckoning. You step inside, and immediately, nothing is as it seems. The walls stretch forward, then twist. One passage leads into a small room. Another leads into a mirror image of the one before. You try to retrace your steps, but the corridor has changed. A stone slab now blocks your way. The door you entered through is gone, or perhaps it was never there. Welcome to the labyrinth's true genius, not just its size or symbolism, but its traps. It's tempting to imagine ancient Egyptian monuments as static, immense, yes, but passive. Yet scattered hints suggest that the labyrinth may have been anything but passive. It might have been a living architecture, designed not only to confuse, but to protect, to defend itself against intruders, thieves, or the uninitiated. In short, a monument wired for deception. Herodotus himself hints at this when he describes the impossibility of navigation. Other ancient writers mention moving stones, hidden doors, and chambers that close behind you. While this sounds like the stuff of pulp fiction, there's some surprising archaeological support for the idea. At several tombs and temples across Egypt, including in the Valley of the Kings, engineers designed false corridors and doors that led nowhere. In some royal tombs, staircases descended into nothing, meant to confuse robbers. Blocked passages were concealed behind polished limestone to resemble blank walls. Even more intriguing, some burial chambers had elaborate locking systems, massive stone plugs, sand release mechanisms, and trapdoors designed to activate when weight was removed from the floor. In other words, security wasn't just an afterthought. It was sacred. And if the labyrinth truly housed the tombs of multiple kings, as Herodotus claimed, it would have been designed with defences in mind. Not simple walls, but psychological mazes, optical tricks, and perhaps even mechanisms. Historians are still debating whether these mechanisms were functional or symbolic. After all, building a corridor that looks like a door and leads nowhere is easier than constructing one that physically moves. But Egyptian craftsmanship was notoriously precise. Builders routinely moved 60-ton granite blocks, with only copper tools and clever physics. The threshold of possibility was far broader than we often assume, and then there's the acoustics. Several scholars have noted that Egyptian temples were designed with sound in mind. High ceilings and resonant chambers amplified chanting, whispering. Galleries allowed voices to travel in strange ways. Could the labyrinth have used such effects deliberately? Imagine a structure where every footstep echoes wrong, where sound doesn't bounce back the way it should, where a whisper spoken in one chamber appears to answer itself in another. More than one traveller to Hawara in the 19th century reported strange auditory effects in the ruins, whispers that seemed to come from below, the sensation of being followed, of movement in nearby chambers when no one else was present. Exaggeration, perhaps, but the architecture was designed to unsettle. Even the light would have been disorienting. The labyrinth's roofed chambers, if built as described, would have blocked most natural sunlight. Illumination would have come from torches or oil lamps, flickering shadows playing along wall carvings, flames dancing across scenes of gods and monsters, eyes carved into the stone seeming to follow you, a hallway that appears longer than it is, a shadow where there should be none. We know the Egyptians used light and dark not just functionally, but ritually. In the temples of Karnak and Dendera, narrow shafts allow sunlight to illuminate certain statues only on key days of the year: solstices, festivals, royal birthdays. Perhaps the labyrinth employed similar techniques, casting divine light into hidden altars, or cloaking others in shadow until the right moment. And now something slightly off topic, but curious all the same. In 2010, an Italian research team published findings from a small site in the Western Desert. They had uncovered what appeared to be a miniature version of a temple complex, a training labyrinth, they called it. Just a few meters across, it had multiple rooms and corridors, none large enough for human occupation. The layout bore a striking resemblance to speculative plans of the Hawara labyrinth. The team speculated it may have been a model used by architects or initiates to practice navigation or ritual movement. A model labyrinth, built to understand the real one, or to survive it. It calls to mind the ancient concept of the trial of the soul. In Egyptian belief, the journey through the afterlife wasn't a straightforward passage, it was a maze filled with dangers, riddles, and gates. The deceased had to recite spells, answer questions, and avoid traps to reach the field of reeds, the paradise beyond. The Book of the Dead even includes maps, vivid drawings of winding paths through fire lakes, serpent-guarded doors, and puzzle-filled hallways. What if the labyrinth wasn't just inspired by this vision? What if it was meant to enact it? To walk through its halls would be to rehearse your death, and if you failed, perhaps you stayed behind, not physically, but symbolically. A fragment of your spirit trapped in stone, a cautionary echo. The architecture of fear is a universal language. Think of modern escape rooms, of fun houses, hall of mirror mazes, horror games where doors disappear and sound lies. Humans are drawn to controlled confusion, to systems we know are trying to trick us. The labyrinth may have been the first, the most sacred, the most earnest. Or perhaps it was simply protection, simple, brutal, effective. Keep the tombs safe, confuse the grave robbers, lead them in but never let them out, and yet somehow the labyrinth itself has become the trap. Not for tomb raiders, but for archaeologists, for historians, for you. Every fact leads to a passage that splits. Every certainty turns out to be a false door. Even the word labyrinth pulls you down a spiral. Greek myths, Roman descriptions, Egyptian silences. You think you're moving forward, but you're walking in circles, and perhaps that was always the point. It begins with a smell, damp stone, old moss, the faint trace of minerals in the air. Then the temperature drops. Your footfalls change their sound, no longer tapping against dry earth, but echoing over hollow space. The passage slopes downward. The walls sweat. A soft trickling sound emerges from the dark, not constant but pulsing, like a breath. You're descending into the underworld of water. For a land defined by sand and sky, Egypt has always had a secret relationship with water. The Nile was its lifeline, of course, but beyond that, water was a metaphysical force. It was the primordial chaos, the abyss from which the gods rose. It was both giver and destroyer, healer and divider. The labyrinth, sitting at the edge of the Fayum, seems to have embraced this duality entirely. Ancient descriptions, particularly those of Herodotus and later Pliny the Elder, mention subterranean chambers beneath the labyrinth that were not just buried, but flooded. The priests, Herodotus tells us, refused to take him down to the lower levels, citing the sacred tombs of kings and crocodiles. But one has to wonder, was it secrecy, or was it danger? Were these tombs protected by more than walls and curses? Were they submerged? Historians are still debating whether these chambers were flooded by design, by accident, or by nature's gradual reclamation. But the idea of deliberately building sacred rooms beneath water is not outlandish. The Egyptians had experience with hydraulic engineering. They built canals, artificial lakes, and waterworks systems that still baffle modern researchers. The entire region around Hawara is thought to have been part of a carefully planned irrigation zone during Amenemhat III's reign. Birket Karun, once Lake Muris, was likely part of that grand hydraulic vision. It would have been filled and drained to control agriculture in the Fayum, and perhaps even to protect or cloak sacred sites. What better way to seal off something sacred than to sink it? An odd fact here, in the nearby temple of Sobek at Kom Ombo, priests conducted rituals in subterranean rooms connected to water channels. One chamber had a deep well that fed into a basin where crocodiles were kept and fed. Visitors stood above, watching the animals below through grates in the floor. Could this architectural motif have originated at Hawara? The notion of underwater chambers has enchanted archaeologists and dreamers alike. In 2009, divers explored an area near the western edge of Birket Karun and claimed to find blocks of cut stone submerged beneath the silt. No inscriptions, no formal layout, but still, rectangular shapes, smoothed corners, arranged as if by design. Nothing was confirmed, but the story lingers, and then there's the more recent work, unpublished, tantalizing, incomplete. When the Matahar expedition scanned the Hawara region, their radar identified not just chambers beneath the ground, but anomalies consistent with empty space containing fluid density. In plain terms, pockets filled with water, deep cavities that weren't simply collapsed rooms or open caves, but possibly designed to hold or channel water. Their exact purpose? Unknown. And here is where the imagination starts to swim. What if the lower labyrinth was meant to be navigated only by boat, or by raft, or perhaps by nothing at all? What if it was symbolic only, a journey of the spirit, not the body, a subterranean duat, echoing the night journey of Ra, the sun god, as he sailed through the underworld on a bark of light? The Book of Gates, an ancient Egyptian funerary text, describes the sun god passing through 12 gates in the underworld, each representing an hour of night. Each gate was guarded, each passage had its own dangers. Could the labyrinth have been a physical model of this journey, with chambers corresponding to those gates, and the water representing the dark river of the Duat? The thought gives weight to the theory that the labyrinth wasn't just a tomb or a temple, but an initiatory space, where priests, or perhaps chosen individuals, underwent symbolic deaths, facing darkness, confusion, and rebirth. To be submerged was to surrender. To rise again was to be transformed. It would explain the secrecy, the fear, the refusal to allow foreign visitors into the lower levels, but there's a more pragmatic angle too. Amenemhat III, the pharaoh associated with the labyrinth, was also responsible for massive waterworks across the Fayum. He may have overseen the redirection of Nile floodwaters into Birket Karun. He understood water's power, both as a tool and as a shield. If the lower chambers were built at or just below the water table, it's likely they flooded not long after their construction. This could have been accidental, or even intentional. Sealing tombs in water creates a natural barrier against grave robbers. It also preserves materials differently. Submersion can protect wood and organic matter from fire and decay, at least for a time. Yet no modern excavation has reached these supposed chambers. The water makes digging nearly impossible. Pumps fail, sand collapses, the earth resists, and it's resisting harder every year. The rising water table in the region, due to modern irrigation and drainage mismanagement, is swallowing more of the site with each passing decade. Salt crystallization is breaking down what stone remains. What was once a stable layer of dry sand is now a swampy hazard. Even ground-penetrating radar is limited in flooded areas. It's a cruel irony. The element that may have once protected the labyrinth is now dissolving it, and no one knows exactly what is being lost. Perhaps carvings, never seen. Perhaps sarcophagi, never lifted. Perhaps even the fabled crocodile mummies, embalmed and sealed in underwater tombs, now quietly drifting apart, their linen wrappings unravelling like forgotten prayers. You wonder, lying there in the dark in your bed or your thoughts, what it must feel like to be one of those statues underwater. To stand for 3,000 years in pitch blackness, hearing only the gurgle of groundwater, the rumble of distant earthquakes, the occasional thud of a shovel above that never comes closer. To wait, unremembered. To listen to the river that no longer flows but seeps, and to wonder whether the sun will ever rise again on the halls built to honour gods that no longer answer. Let's imagine, just for a moment, that the labyrinth was never meant to be a tomb. Not primarily, anyway. The ancient writers spoke often of kings and sacred crocodiles buried beneath it, but something in their words always hinted at a deeper purpose. Herodotus said he was not allowed into the lower chambers. Strabo described its courts in admiration, but with hesitation, and Diodorus, ever dramatic, claimed it held the knowledge of all Egypt, stored in secret. If these halls were built not to bury the dead, but to shape the living, what does that change? Quite a bit. Some Egyptologists, mystics, and independent researchers have proposed an alternate vision of the labyrinth, not as a monument to death, but as a living school, a temple of initiation, a place where only the chosen few walk through darkness in search of light. It's not so far-fetched as it sounds. In ancient Egypt, learning was often inseparable from ritual. Priests were not simply caretakers of temples, they were astronomers, doctors, mathematicians, and record keepers. The process of becoming a high priest or scribe was intense, private, and filled with symbolic ordeals. The deeper your knowledge, the deeper into the temple you could go. The architecture mirrored the path of understanding. Could the labyrinth have been a final test? A structure designed to confuse the senses, to strip away assumptions, to purify through disorientation. Historians are still debating whether mystery schools, esoteric institutions of wisdom, existed in ancient Egypt in the way later Greek and Roman sources describe. But there are clues. The Temple of Luxor, for instance, includes what appears to be an initiatory path, a sequence of progressively more sacred chambers ending in darkness. The texts found in Edfu refer to houses of life, sacred libraries where wisdom was transmitted from mouth to ear, not hand to stone. The labyrinth may have been the grandest of them all. 12 courts, dozens of chambers, a double-layered design, water, darkness, silence. All of it aligns with the blueprint of initiation, first confusion, then clarity, and the symbolism is thick. 12 courts could represent the 12 stages of spiritual growth. The upper world and underworld mirror the dual nature of man. Even the name labyrinth evokes the inner twistings of the mind. You do not simply enter a maze, you become one. Oddly, the Greeks, who are often dismissed for misunderstanding Egypt, may have picked up more than we give them credit for. The mystery cults of Eleusis, Orphism, and later Hermeticism all speak of sacred journeys into darkness, guided by ritual, ending in symbolic rebirth. The initiates were forbidden to speak of what they saw. Some scholars believe these Greek rites were inspired by older Egyptian traditions, carried home by travellers like Pythagoras and Plato. If the labyrinth was such a place, what might have occurred there? It's unlikely we'll ever know for certain. But we can speculate. One might imagine a new initiate being led into the first court, blindfolded, then left to find their way through a sequence of chambers, each containing trials. Not physical torture, this wasn't a prison, but mental or spiritual puzzles. Perhaps reciting sacred texts in total darkness. Perhaps navigating chambers using only sound or scent. Perhaps being submerged in water, ritually drowned, then led into light. Or perhaps the trials were more symbolic still. In the Book of the Dead, the soul must pass through 42 gates, each guarded by a deity who asks a question. The soul must answer truthfully, or be denied entry to paradise. Imagine a version of this written not on papyrus, but in stone. Even the crocodile, so often seen as a threat, may have served as a symbol of fear to be conquered. To walk the labyrinth might have been to face Sobek himself, not as an enemy, but as a guardian of transformation. Those who emerged were not the same. And here's an odd, off-topic but deliciously relevant fact. In the Middle Ages, European alchemists used the term labyrinth to describe the winding path of inner transformation. They drew it as spirals, knots, and chambers filled with symbols. Some included crocodiles. Most ended in a simple centre, the reborn self. It's a compelling image. The labyrinth, not as a trap, but as a chrysalis. A caterpillar doesn't climb out of its cocoon. It dissolves inside it, loses its shape, becomes unrecognizable before reassembling. That too is what initiates may have experienced, a dissolution of identity, an unlearning. And perhaps that's why the place was kept secret. Not to guard a treasure, but to protect a process. Not all were ready. Even Herodotus, curious and bold, was denied full access. He was an outsider, a spectator. The inner halls were for those who had earned their passage not with fame, but with silence. What happened to those initiates? They left no memoirs, no carved names, no glowing tablets. Their work was inward. But maybe that was the point. In a world obsessed with permanence, perhaps the labyrinth was built to be impermanent. Not in stone, but in experience. Not in history, but in memory. Maybe that's why it was allowed to fade, why no one rushed to restore it. Because its power had already passed into the bones of those who walked it. And sometimes, the greatest temples leave no trace. except in the way a person walks after they've left them. Quieter, slower, wiser. The labyrinth at Hawara may be the most famous lost structure in Egyptian memory, but it is not alone in its mystery. Across Egypt's ancient landscape, from Saqqara to Giza, from Abydos to Dendera, the land is scattered with echoes, architectural rhymes that hint at shared patterns, forgotten blueprints, or perhaps decoys in a much grander game of sacred misdirection. Let's start in Saqqara. The step pyramid of Djoser, constructed around 2700 BCE by the master architect Imhotep, is often hailed as Egypt's first monumental stone building. But its true marvel isn't visible from the outside. Beneath the step pyramid lies a sprawling complex of underground corridors, sealed shafts and ceremonial chambers. Over 5 kilometers of tunnels snake beneath the surface, many of which were deliberately sealed with rubble or blocked by stone plugs. Sound familiar? Historians are still debating whether Djoser's subterranean complex was designed primarily for burial or for spiritual initiation. While his sarcophagus was eventually placed at the bottom of a 28-meter shaft, most of the chambers were filled with symbolic items, fake doors, empty niches, offering tables. It was a structure designed not for function, but for effect. Confusion, replication, false depth. A maze in all but name, and this was nearly 700 years before the labyrinth. Was the Hawara complex merely expanding on this idea? Or was it the perfected version of a ritual form that had begun with Djoser? The possibility is tantalizing, that Egypt's most elaborate structures were built not linearly over time but cyclically, each one reflecting, revising and reenacting an older sacred design. Then there's the Serapeum, also at Saqqara. Discovered in the 19th century, the Serapeum consists of a long underground passageway lined with massive granite sarcophagi, each weighing upwards of 70 tons, believed to house the mummified remains of sacred Apis bulls. These bulls, avatars of Ptah and later Osiris, were worshipped and embalmed with great ceremony. The Serapeum's corridors are tight, angular, deliberately difficult to navigate. Some corners seem built for confusion, not access. What's odd is the craftsmanship. The sarcophagi are astonishingly precise. Polished to a mirror finish on the inside, their lids so finely cut they form an airtight seal without mortar. The engineering is beyond what was thought possible for the period. Some have proposed that the Serapeum, like the labyrinth, was more than a tomb, that it served a ritual or even metaphysical function, tied to resonance, magnetism, or consciousness. That's speculative, of course, but the design itself feels deliberate, not merely storage, but trial. Giza offers more of the same. Beneath the pyramids, particularly the Great Pyramid of Khufu, lies another mystery. The unfinished subterranean chamber carved into bedrock is stark and strange. A long descending passage leads to a simple rectangular pit, with no decorations, no inscriptions. Egyptologists often call it a failed attempt, a discarded idea. But others have noted that the chamber's dimensions are precisely aligned with the pyramid's geometry, that it may have served as a symbolic underworld, representing the lower spiritual plane. And then there are the so-called trial passages found near the Great Pyramid. Roughly 87 meters south of Khufu's pyramid lies a set of carved trenches and channels in the bedrock that seem to mimic the interior layout of the pyramid itself. The passages go nowhere. They're shallow, incomplete, almost like practice runs, or decoys. Historians are still debating whether these trial passages were training grounds for workers or models used in construction. But there's another possibility, that they were created to confuse grave robbers, or more intriguingly, to mirror something deeper, a model of the pyramid's spirit, not its structure, a whisper rather than a shout. Which brings us back to Hawara. What if the labyrinth wasn't the only one of its kind? What if it was part of a network, real or symbolic, of mirrored structures spread across Egypt, each one part decoy, part ritual, part reflection? The Egyptians loved replication. They built temple after temple to the same gods, using the same language, same proportions, same orientations. It was never about novelty. It was about maintaining cosmic balance. An odd fact, the Luxor temple, often overshadowed by its neighbour at Karnak, is not aligned with true north like most Egyptian temples. Its axis is skewed. Some scholars believe this was deliberate, that Luxor was intended as a spiritual twin to Karnak, but on a slanted plane, to reflect a deeper metaphysical symmetry. Perhaps the labyrinth fits into this same mirrored logic. A temple for the crocodile god built beside an artificial lake, reflecting an older structure on higher ground. Or a ceremonial centre echoing a cosmic pattern, the movement of the stars, the sun's path, the journey of the soul. And it's not just Egypt. Labyrinthine structures appear across ancient cultures. The Minoans built sprawling palace complexes in Crete, notably at Knossos, where the myth of the Minotaur was born. The Indians built massive temple complexes like Angkor Wat, with interior mazes symbolizing spiritual journeys. The Mayans etched labyrinth patterns into the floors of ceremonial platforms. Were these parallels coincidental? Or are we glimpsing something deeper, a shared human need to encode knowledge in confusion, to hide meaning in repetition? It's tempting to think the labyrinth was singular, but the more you look, the more it multiplies, not just in stone, but in memory. A hallway that reappears in another city, a corridor duplicated beneath another pyramid, a feeling you've been here before, though you know you haven't. The Egyptians may have built the labyrinth once, but its pattern was carved again and again, not in granite, but in design, in ritual, in rhythm. And perhaps that's why it endures, because it was never meant to stand alone. It was always part of something bigger, a web of echoes, a conversation of stone, a mirror of mirrors reflecting endlessly, until you forget which side you started on. The Romans were not known for subtlety. When they encountered Egypt, they didn't just conquer it, they absorbed it. They took its gods, its grain, its gold. They took Cleopatra's kingdom and folded it into their empire. But what they did with its monuments, especially the labyrinth, is something still debated. Did they destroy it in greed, or try to preserve it through repurposing? Let's walk slowly through the ruins of that question. By the time Rome entered Egypt in earnest, following the defeat of Mark Antony and Cleopatra at Actium in 31 BCE, the labyrinth was already in decline. Herodotus had seen it centuries earlier. Strabo wrote that it was still impressive, but partly collapsed. Pliny, writing a bit later, mentioned it with something between awe and eulogy. It was already becoming a legend. And then, silence. The ruins remained, of course. Flinders Petrie found traces of them, stripped and broken. But the grandeur was gone. So where did it go? One theory, widely accepted, is that the Romans dismantled the labyrinth piece by piece. It was, after all, a treasure trove of fine stone, alabaster, limestone, basalt. Materials ready for reuse in public works. The Romans were master builders but rarely mined their own resources. They recycled. They harvested the past. Temples became palaces. Tombs became bathhouses. The old gods made excellent floor tiles. At Hawara, large amounts of cut stone are simply missing. Petrie documented foundation trenches where massive blocks had clearly been removed. Some blocks were found reused in nearby villages, their inscriptions chiselled off or defaced. Others may have been shipped downriver to be incorporated into buildings in Alexandria, Fayum, or even Rome itself. To a conqueror, this isn't theft, it's inheritance. But not all Romans were careless. Some approached Egypt with reverence. Emperor Hadrian was obsessed with Egyptian mysticism. He travelled the Nile, he read its texts. He even rebuilt temples in the traditional style. His villa at Tivoli, near Rome, contains Egyptian-inspired elements, including a structure called the Canopus, a long reflecting pool lined with statues that echoes, ever so faintly, the ceremonial waterworks of the Fayum. Was this respect, or rebranding? Historians are still debating whether Roman engineers tried to preserve the labyrinth's core or simply salvage its shell. Some argue that Roman military architects studied its design and incorporated its principles into their own fortresses, radial layouts, controlled passageways, concealed entries. Others believe they studied the labyrinth not as architecture, but as metaphor, as allegory for control. There's an odd historical footnote here. A Roman general named Petronius, stationed in Egypt under the reign of Emperor Augustus, reportedly visited the region and ordered the removal of certain dangerous texts and symbols. His account is vague, but later Roman records refer to suppressed rites associated with crocodile cults. Was the labyrinth's dismantling part of this purging? Was it seen not just as valuable stone, but as a threat? It would not be the first time Rome erased what it feared, and yet in the Roman imagination the labyrinth survived. Writers of the late Empire like Macrobius and Marcianus Capella referenced labyrinths frequently. They treated them as symbols of hidden knowledge, of the soul's descent into confusion and ascent into clarity. By then, the Greek myth of the Minotaur had taken over, but some scholars believed that the Egyptian labyrinth was the deeper source. It's easy to see why. The Roman mind loved systems, order from chaos, and what is a labyrinth, if not a perfect metaphor for empire? A way of channeling motion, of defining power through passage, a way to get lost, and then to be found by those who built the map. In this light, perhaps Rome didn't destroy the labyrinth, it translated it, not in stone, but in structure. One of the more peculiar theories, held by fringe historians and dreamers, suggests that Roman engineers recreated the labyrinth in secret beneath another city, perhaps under Rome itself. Some point to the Mithraeums, underground temples dedicated to the mysterious god Mithras, as echoes of Egyptian underground ritual space. Narrow, symbolic, confusing by design. These cults thrived during the same period that the labyrinth was stripped. Coincidence? Perhaps. But there's something compelling about the idea that the labyrinth, like a living thing, survived its own dismemberment by dispersing into other forms. A stone here, a ritual there, a layout reused, misunderstood, but alive. Even Christianity, rising within the bones of the Roman Empire, adopted labyrinths. By the Middle Ages they appear carved into cathedral floors in France and Italy, used not for navigation, but for contemplation. Pilgrims walked their winding paths in silence, mimicking the journey to the holy city or to enlightenment. The spiritual labyrinth had replaced the physical one, but its roots, perhaps, lay in Hawara. An odd fact to consider. In the 15th century, Leonardo da Vinci drew diagrams of labyrinths, precise, angular, multi-layered structures, with no known source material. Some suggest he was inspired by descriptions from Pliny, others believe he had access to lost Roman texts. Either way, the labyrinth haunted minds far removed from its dusty ruins, which brings us back to the theft. Did the Romans loot the labyrinth? Absolutely. But did they forget it? Not at all. They carried its stones across oceans. They carried its patterns across centuries. They absorbed it into their symbols, their faith, their cities. And in doing so, they gave it a strange kind of immortality. Because while the labyrinth no longer stands at Hawara, its echo stands everywhere, in churches, in crypts, in city plans, in stories. It was dismembered, but not destroyed. It lives, like so many things Roman, in pieces scattered across time, waiting to be reassembled. They start out promisingly enough, a shadow under a rock, a depression in the sand, a narrow crack in a half-buried wall. You duck your head, you step inside, you descend. And for a moment, just a moment, you think you found something. Then silence, just smooth stone, a dead end. These are the tunnels of Hawara, hundreds of them, short, confusing, terminating in abrupt, featureless walls. They have puzzled generations of explorers. Some are hand-carved with signs of chiselling. Others are smooth, like natural crevices that were merely adopted. Some slope downward, some remain flat. None go very far. None lead to a central chamber, a treasure room or a crypt. At least none that we've found. Flinders Petrie catalogued dozens of these shafts during his time at Hawara. Many descended just a few metres before halting in stone. Others split into side chambers, rooms with no doors, no inscriptions, and sometimes no floors, just water. Petrie called them false tombs, or test shafts, possibly meant to deceive tomb robbers or to exhaust them. But even he admitted the sheer number was unusual, excessive, overbuilt. Why would you construct dozens, maybe hundreds, of dead ends? Historians are still debating whether these tunnels were failed construction efforts, symbolic spaces, or part of a larger system we no longer understand. One theory suggests that the ancient builders used these shafts as part of a ritual, perhaps the act of carving a tunnel into sacred ground, regardless of whether it led anywhere, was more important than the outcome. Another theory is more psychological. To enter a dark tunnel that leads nowhere is an exercise in humility, in disorientation, in quiet dread. It mirrors the journey of the soul in Egyptian belief, the attempt to reach the field of reeds, paradise, through a treacherous passage filled with traps and trials. Perhaps these tunnels were not meant to be literal corridors but spiritual ones, training grounds, tests of trust. There's a haunting quote attributed to a 19th century traveller who visited the site. Each opening seemed like a promise of understanding, each silence a kind of warning. I began to feel that the labyrinth was less a place than an intention. That sentiment lingers today. Some of the tunnels were obviously built by humans. They bear the marks, but others are ambiguous. Nature is a patient architect. Earthquakes, flooding, and groundwater can create cracks that resemble doors. Over time, people dig into these natural faults, extend them, shape them. The line between geology and engineering becomes blurred. But even the natural-looking tunnels at Hawara seem suspiciously uniform. Their widths are consistent, their angles too deliberate. Some even curve gently to the right, as if guiding a person not to a chamber, but to a state of mind. A few explorers have reported an acoustic phenomenon known as dead echoes in these tunnels. Shouting into them produces no reverberation. Whispers vanish almost instantly. The effect is unnerving. The silence becomes dense, physical. It presses against you. One modern researcher described it as standing inside the memory of forgetting. Creepy, certainly. But here's something odder. In 2012, a small academic team used microgravity scanners to explore the subsoil at Hawara. They were hoping to detect cavities, voids in the earth caused by man-made chambers or collapsed passages. Their data, though inconclusive, suggested the presence of vertical shafts that ended in horizontal planes. Not staircases, not ramps, just terminations. As if someone had dug down and stopped. And there's the question, were these shafts meant to go somewhere, but were interrupted, or were they always meant to stop? In temple architecture elsewhere in Egypt, there are examples of symbolic doorways carved into solid walls. These false doors were meant as spiritual portals, places where the ka, or soul, could pass through into the next world. They were never meant to open physically. Could the tunnels at Hawara be something similar? False passages, ritual dead ends, invitations not to proceed but to reflect. An off-topic but eerily resonant fact. In ancient Japanese Shinto shrines, there are gates known as tori that mark a threshold, but often lead to nothing, no building, no altar, just a place, a space of transition. The act of passing through is the ritual. Perhaps Egypt's dead-end tunnels served a similar function, a movement into sacred silence. Yet some of these shafts contain other mysteries. Petrie discovered a few tunnels that had been sealed at their ends with what appeared to be deliberately shaped plugs. Massive. Blocks slid into place. They weren't decorative. They were mechanical, designed to obstruct. But what lies behind them? No one knows. Excavation is risky. The groundwater threatens collapse. The plugs themselves weigh several tons. Modern archaeologists, strapped for funding and facing regulatory obstacles, have chosen not to risk forcing them open, and so they wait. Behind the stone, behind time, like everything else in the labyrinth. And then there's this. One of the shafts, now partly collapsed and flooded, was reported by early explorers to descend much farther than the others. Local guides claimed it led to a room of mirrors, a chamber so perfectly polished that lantern light reflected endlessly. No archaeological record confirms this. The report was filed, then lost. Just another echo. But even the echoes speak. The tunnels of Hawara may not lead anywhere, but they lead us. They guide the imagination, like threads laid down by a culture that knew the power of almost. They tease us with intent. They don't offer answers. They offer questions, and the courage to keep asking them. Because sometimes, the most sacred knowledge isn't at the end of a path. It's in the moment you realize the path has ended. And yet, you're still walking. It's not what you expect when you look at a satellite image of the Egyptian desert. You're supposed to see randomness, rocks, dunes, faint outlines of forgotten ruins if you're lucky. But at Hawara, what emerges from above is geometry. Not natural, not accidental. A grid, laid out with a precision that's eerie. Angular lines, perfect right angles, repeating rectangles. Buried under centuries of sand, this silent pattern stretches across the landscape like the skeleton of an idea too large to hold in the mind. The first to notice it weren't archaeologists. They were scientists working on satellite imaging in the early 2000s, testing ground-penetrating radar and infrared scans to detect changes in soil composition. In several published images, faint but clear lines appeared, too organized to be random, too widespread to be the ruins of a single building, and they formed a grid. Some say it's the footprint of the labyrinth, others say it's merely agricultural, remnants of ancient irrigation canals, field divisions, drainage systems. But the depth is wrong for farming. Too deep, too wide, and more importantly, it doesn't match what we know of Egypt's agricultural layouts. So what is it? Historians are still debating whether this subterranean geometry represents buried walls, foundations, or voids, spaces where buildings once stood or still do. The lines align suspiciously well with the dimensions described in ancient texts. The 12 courts, the central halls, the mirrored design. It's not a perfect match, but it's close enough to feel deliberate, and perhaps more unsettling. The pattern seems to extend beyond the area traditionally identified as the labyrinth's footprint. If true, it would mean the structure was even larger than believed, or that the labyrinth was not a building, but a complex, a city within a city, with administrative zones, shrines, housing for priests, storage rooms for rituals, a functioning ecosystem of sacred order. Think of it this way. What if the visible labyrinth was merely the ceremonial heart, and the rest, a geometric sprawl beneath the sand, was the body that supported it? There's a strange modern parallel here. In 1963, during the Cold War, the US Air Force developed a project called Operation Igloo White in Laos. They used electronic sensors dropped from planes to detect enemy movement. These sensors, buried just below the surface, transmitted data to aircraft flying overhead. The entire system formed an invisible grid, an unseen structure hiding in plain earth. What if the labyrinth's grid was something like that? Not a building, but a network, of meaning, of memory, of control. An odd fact. In some traditions of ancient China, imperial cities were designed with massive invisible grids, 9 squares across, 9 squares down. Each square represented a cosmological element: water, fire, earth, air, ancestor, descendant. The emperor sat at the centre, the axis mundi. Roads, walls, and buildings followed this spiritual math. The unseen dictated the visible. Was something similar at work in Egypt? The Hermopolis cosmology, followed during Amenemhat III's time, emphasized balance, symmetry, and sacred numerology. The Ogdoad, the 8 original gods, were said to emerge from the watery abyss surrounding the central primeval mound. The labyrinth, sitting at the edge of Lake Moeris, may have been designed as a reflection of that myth, a sacred map etched into the earth, invisible from the ground, but revealed when viewed from above, like a prayer carved into the back of a mirror. This brings us to the concept of Saku. In Egyptian thought, Saku was the hidden light, not just literal light, but the essence of divine intelligence, the invisible pattern behind things. Temples were built according to Saku, with hidden geometries designed to influence spirit and perception. You didn't just walk through stone, you walked through a frequency. Could the grid beneath Hawara be Saku rendered in sand? If so, it changes everything, because it means the labyrinth wasn't just a maze, it was a device, a spiritual engine, and here's where the silence grows thicker. In 2008, the Belgian-Egyptian Matahar expedition confirmed the presence of subsurface geometry consistent with man-made features. Their non-invasive survey, done with ground-penetrating radar, mapped structures beneath the modern waterline, clearly rectangular, clearly ordered. But after the initial announcement, something odd happened. Nothing. No formal excavation. No academic papers in major journals. Just a few scattered reports. A PowerPoint at a conference. A website archived and neglected. Then, quiet. Why? Some blame bureaucratic hurdles. Egypt's antiquities authorities are famously cautious, particularly with foreign-led projects. Others suspect more political motives, national pride, archaeological turf wars, fear of sensationalism. But fringe theorists go further. They suggest suppression, a deliberate silencing of the findings due to what might lie beneath. Even respected voices in the field admit frustration. One senior Egyptologist, speaking anonymously in a 2014 interview, said, "There's something under Hawara, we all know it, but no one wants to be the one to dig it up." That's quite a sentence. It implies more than hesitation. It implies trepidation, the kind of fear that comes not from superstition, but from the weight of implication. What happens if the labyrinth is found? What if it rewrites what we thought we knew? What if its structure reveals a level of sophistication and purpose that outpaces our assumptions about ancient cognition. Because a grid like this, it's not ornamental, it's intentional. Whether it was used for spatial planning, ritual movement, acoustic amplification, or energy control, we can't say, not yet. But its presence alone hints at a mind not content with simply building up. It wanted to build under, to shape space not only in 3 dimensions but in meaning. The grid is there, beneath the sand, beneath the salt, waiting. And in a strange way, it's the perfect metaphor for everything the labyrinth represents. A vast, unseen pattern, just underfoot, just out of reach, just enough to let you imagine, just enough to keep you walking. The sands of Hawara, quiet and unbothered, could have become a cultural epicenter. They almost did. Once. In the early 20th century, a bold vision flickered to life. To build a museum, right there, above the ruins of the labyrinth. Not in Cairo, not in London, but in situ where history had taken root and then disappeared. A museum not just of artifacts, but of absence, of memory, of the weight of unknowing. It never happened. But for a time, the idea was real. Flinders Petrie, ever the tireless archaeologist, had proposed something like it after his work at Hawara. He believed that the site needed preservation and visibility. He even imagined reassembling parts of the labyrinth's fallen blocks, like puzzle pieces scattered over millennia. There were drawings, notes, letters exchanged. Egypt's Department of Antiquities showed interest. So did a few wealthy backers in Britain. The plan was to build a research centre with a modest museum, something local, sustainable, focused. A permanent presence to protect the fragile ruins from further degradation, and a home for the finds that were too large or too sensitive to move. But time passed. World wars erupted, funds dried up, politics changed, Egypt moved closer to independence, priorities shifted, and Hawara, as ever, returned to stillness. Historians are still debating whether the proposal was ever viable. The site's high water table, its relative isolation, and the difficulty of excavation all pose challenges. And there was the deeper issue. How do you preserve something when you're not entirely sure what it is? The labyrinth defies display. It is not a single object, or even a single structure. It is a field of ghosts, an architecture of silence, a place where every new discovery raises more questions than it answers. But the dream of a museum never quite died. In the 1960s there was another attempt, this time by a coalition of Egyptian and German scholars. The proposal included a multidisciplinary research station and a small exhibition hall built on raised platforms to avoid groundwater issues. Once again, drawings were made. Test pits were dug. Local officials were cautiously optimistic. And then, nothing. No funds, no permits, no follow-through. Instead, the major artifacts from Hawara ended up elsewhere. The Louvre, the British Museum, the Petrie Museum in London holds many of the statues and carvings, their provenance traced in tidy museum font to Hawara 1890, but they sit disconnected, like sentences cut from a paragraph. They don't tell the story of the labyrinth, they tell the story of its diaspora. An odd fact, in the 1980s, a small travelling exhibit called The Mysteries of Egypt included a reconstructed scale model of the labyrinth based on Herodotus's writings. It toured several cities in Europe and North America. Visitors marvelled at the tiny corridors, the 12 courts, the little crocodile figurines placed in tiny water-filled troughs. For most, it was their first encounter with the word labyrinth, not linked to Greek myths. And then the exhibit ended. The model was stored. No permanent museum ever adopted it. It's almost poetic. The labyrinth again resisted enclosure. There's a pattern here. Every time someone tries to pin it down, to name it, to own it, to display it, it slips away. Funds fall through. Wars intervene. Files vanish. Permissions expire. Is it bad luck? Or is it the nature of the thing? The ancient Egyptians believed that certain knowledge was dangerous if removed from its proper place. Wisdom, they taught, had to be earned, not taken. To expose a sacred truth before its time was to disrupt Mayat, the balance of the world. Some temples included inner sanctums that could be opened only once a year. Others held statues never meant to be seen by human eyes. Perhaps the labyrinth follows this logic. It does not want to be known. Not fully. Not yet. Still, There have been whispers of reviving the museum plan. In 2010, just before the Arab Spring, a consortium of European universities floated a proposal for a Hawara heritage initiative. It included a visitors' centre, an interactive archive, and the ambitious dream of restoring part of the site's original layout based on radar scans. And then, revolution. Budget cuts. Silence. The project dissolved. A scholar involved in the plan later said in an interview, "We kept drawing walls, but the sand kept moving." It wasn't just a metaphor. The desert reclaims what is not protected. The outlines of chambers found one year may be invisible the next. Without a permanent presence, the labyrinth is always receding. Today, if you visit Hawara, you'll find a dusty guard shack, a few scattered fragments, some fencing. The pyramid of Amenemhat III sits quietly, watched more by goats than by tourists. There's no museum, no markers, no shaded paths with placards. You might not even know you're standing on something at all. But you are. Beneath your feet lies a structure that once stunned the ancient world, a place more famous than the pyramids, a monument that drew the awe of Herodotus, Strabo, Diodorus, and perhaps even emperors. And today, it's invisible, not destroyed, just unclaimed. A museum was never built. But maybe that's because the labyrinth is the museum, a space that preserves not artifacts but questions, not objects but atmosphere, not answers, but the whisper of a hallway that leads nowhere and somehow still leaves you feeling watched. To understand the architecture of the labyrinth, you may need to forget that it's a building, forget stone, forget floor plans, forget walls and ceilings and courts and tunnels. What if the labyrinth wasn't designed to be seen from above, or even from the inside, but from within the mind? What if the entire structure, so carefully described by ancient writers, was not just a building, but a translation, from myth into stone? The ancient Egyptians were not passive mythologists. Their stories weren't bedtime tales. They were instruction manuals for reality. Every myth held a blueprint, and every sacred site encoded that myth in its proportions, in its orientation, in its function. The temple was not a place to tell stories. It was the story itself, made solid. And nowhere is this more apparent than in the mythology of the afterlife. The journey of the soul, described in countless tomb texts, coffin inscriptions, and the so-called Book of the Dead, is essentially a labyrinth, a twisting passage through darkness, a voyage with gates, guardians, riddles, judgments. The soul, newly released from the body, must pass through corridors and chambers, some familiar, some terrifying. The threat is not of death, but of disintegration, to forget one's name, to fail to speak the correct incantation, to fall into oblivion. Does this sound familiar? Herodotus and Strabo describe the labyrinth as a place of overwhelming complexity, of repeated rooms, of twin courts, of doors within doors, some leading to dead ends. Beneath it, they said, were the tombs of kings and sacred crocodiles, guardians of the boundary between life and death. Historians are still debating whether this design was purely functional or symbolic, but many now believe the labyrinth was more than a building. It was a metaphysical map, a walkable model of the soul's journey through the Duat, the Egyptian underworld. And once you see it that way, you begin to notice things. The 12 courts could represent the 12 hours of the night, the 12 divisions through which the sun god Ra must pass, battling monsters and chaos to be reborn in the morning. The false doors and dead-end tunnels mirror the 42 judges the soul must face, each requiring a specific confession, a denial of wrongdoing, a declaration of innocence. Even the crocodiles, so often cast as bizarre ritual animals, fit within this logic. Sobek, the crocodile god, was not just a beast. He was a protector, a bridge between water and land, a guardian of the gates. His presence at Hawara was not incidental. It was essential. Oddly enough, in the Amduat, a funerary text older than the Book of the Dead, Ra travels through a labyrinth-like realm during his nightly descent. He moves through a series of caverns, each more dangerous than the last, assisted by serpent gods, solar barks, and spells of light. The journey is not spatial. It is temporal, psychological, and moral. It is not unlike walking the labyrinth itself, and there's more. In Egyptian temple design, the innermost sanctum was never visible from the entrance. The path curved, doors aligned only for brief moments, columns obscured your view. The approach was never direct. You had to earn your proximity to the divine. What you saw depended on what you knew. The building trained your perception. That's not architecture, that's initiation. And the labyrinth may have been the most extreme version of it. A full-body initiation. A place where myths were enacted, not recited. Where you became Osiris, dismembered and reassembled. Where you followed the sun, were judged, weighed, and, if worthy, reborn. Some have proposed that the labyrinth may have been used only at certain times of the year, perhaps during specific festivals or solar alignments. The rising or setting of Sirius, for example, marked the new year and was associated with rebirth. If certain chambers aligned with these celestial events, then movement through the labyrinth may have mirrored the passage of the cosmos itself. A calendar, made of corridors, a clock, built in stone. But of course, much of this is speculation. There are no surviving Egyptian texts that describe the labyrinth directly. No official guidebook, no floor plan with labelled mythological references. But that silence may be intentional. The most sacred rituals were never written down. They were experienced, they were walked, they were endured. Even today, modern labyrinths, those circular paths laid in gardens, hospitals, churches, are used as meditation tools. You walk in, you get lost, you find the centre, you return changed. There is no trick, just motion and awareness. The oldest known ritual in the world might be simply walk in circles until your mind quiets. That too is myth as blueprint. An odd but telling fact. In the 19th century, a French occultist named Paul Christian claimed the labyrinth of Egypt contained secret chambers used by the priesthood to test initiates. He described rituals of terror and ecstasy, symbolic deaths, and whispered truths passed from mouth to ear in candlelit rooms. There's no archaeological evidence to support this, but the imagery stuck. It reflected a deep suspicion that the labyrinth was always about more than space. It was about thresholds, crossing them, returning different. And perhaps that's why the myth persists, even when the stones are gone. Because deep down, the labyrinth was never just a building, it was a state of being, a journey that had to be walked blind, in faith, through confusion, guided not by maps but by memory, not by light but by myth. And maybe that's why, even now, we continue looking. Because in the end, to search for the labyrinth is to search for meaning, not in what we build, but in what we endure. It was the late 1990s. Egypt's tourism industry was booming, and archaeology was once again on the rise. Satellite imaging, radar, and digital mapping were transforming the study of ancient sites. Hawara, long forgotten, long ignored, briefly flickered back into focus. And then, it didn't. Because what was supposed to be the next big dig never happened. Files exist, proposals were drafted, permits prepared, equipment was assembled, teams from Europe and Egypt were preparing to work together on a new, large-scale excavation of the site surrounding Amenemhat III's pyramid. The stated goal was modest: study the structural integrity of the pyramid and map surrounding ruins to evaluate the feasibility of deeper excavation. But behind closed doors, the ambitions were larger. There was hope, quiet but tangible, that this dig would reveal something more, that it would reach beneath the known levels of Hawara, that it would tap into the ancient rumours, the lower level of the labyrinth, the submerged crypts, the forgotten courts. Everything the ancient authors had whispered about. It never happened. Historians are still debating why. Officially, the reasons given were logistical: groundwater, land use conflicts, rising costs, disputes between administrative departments. Nothing dramatic, just the slow death of a complicated project. But if you talk to the researchers who were involved, off the record, they'll tell you something else. They'll tell you about the quiet warnings, about permits that were suddenly revoked, about meetings with officials that ended in vague statements like, "It is not the right time," or "There are other priorities." One team leader claimed they were directly told, "There are some things better left undisturbed." Better left undisturbed. What does that mean? Egypt's Supreme Council of Antiquities, then under the leadership of Zahi Hawass, was famously protective of the nation's heritage, and rightly so. Egypt's antiquities had been looted, exploited, and misrepresented for centuries. Caution was warranted. But some believe this caution turned into something else, something closer to fear or control. Because Hawara isn't just another pyramid, it's a place soaked in contradiction. Too many accounts, too few physical remains, Too much mythology, too many anomalies, it resists explanation, and anything that resists explanation, especially in a country whose identity is tightly interwoven with its ancient past, poses a threat. You can't showcase something that refuses to be defined. And then there's the geopolitical angle. In the 1990s, Egypt was navigating a tense moment, balancing tradition, tourism, nationalism, and global academic partnerships. Allowing a foreign-led team to potentially uncover something world-shaking beneath Egyptian soil was risky. What if they found a structure that rewrote history? What if they unearthed something that didn't fit within the neat dynastic timelines? What if the labyrinth turned out to be older than we thought? Or worse, what if it turned out to be something completely other? An odd fact, during the same decade, other non-conventional sites, like the Osirian at Abydos, began receiving renewed attention from independent researchers who claimed these monuments showed signs of advanced pre-dynastic construction, that they had been built with knowledge long lost. The mainstream response? Silence, or firm denial. Now combine that tension with Hawara, a site known for its mystery, and a high-profile excavation that might attract media attention. Suddenly, a postponed project starts to make sense. But what makes the story even stranger is what happened afterward. The area around Hawara was quietly reclassified. Certain zones became restricted. Local access was limited. Survey teams were told to apply for permits through more complicated channels. The site was not shut down, but it was placed in a kind of slow-motion quarantine. It still is. Even today, proposals to excavate deeply at Hawara are met with bureaucratic hurdles. Scholars working in the region speak cautiously. No one says there's an outright ban, but it's clear that doors don't open easily there. Which raises the question, what's under that sand? Is it merely a collapsed monument? Or is it something unclassifiable? One member of the cancelled 1990s team later remarked that the most haunting part wasn't what they found. It was what they were told not to look for. A silence shaped like a warning. And maybe that's the real story of the Forbidden Dig. Not suppression, not conspiracy, but recognition. That the labyrinth, as an idea, is more powerful than any excavation could handle. That to truly uncover it would require more than tools and funding. It would require rewriting not just Egypt's history, but our assumptions about what the ancients knew and how they knew it. After all, to find the labyrinth is to confront a paradox, a monument described in great detail, yet invisible, built with precision, yet dismantled, remembered for centuries, yet never fully known. Maybe the dig never happened because the labyrinth doesn't want to be found. Not yet. Maybe it's still watching, still listening, still waiting for the right question. Not where is it, but what is it? And when we finally ask that question, not in maps or drills or press releases, but in stillness, perhaps the sand will shift, just slightly, and let us in. In 2008, the desert murmured again. A team of researchers from Belgium, working in collaboration with Egyptian authorities, arrived at Hawara, not with shovels, not with picks, but with machines that could see beneath the surface without touching a grain of sand. The project was called the Matahar Expedition. The name was not chosen lightly. In Arabic, Matahar means labyrinth. Their goal was simple, to conduct a non-invasive survey of the Hawara site using ground-penetrating radar and electromagnetic imaging. The team wanted to map whatever lay beneath the visible ruins, the collapsed courts, the scattered blocks, the forgotten pathways. Their approach was methodical, professional, and, perhaps most importantly, quiet. They worked under the supervision of the Supreme Council of Antiquities. Their equipment was advanced, their methodology sound. What they found, however, was anything but simple. Their radar scans revealed massive geometric anomalies beneath the sand. Large rectangular voids, sharp-edged patterns, layered structures at depths consistent with artificial construction. Some of the shapes measured over 30 meters across, others extended in long linear alignments, and all of it lay beneath the surface, below the known ruins of the labyrinth, beneath layers of sediment and silt, in a zone long considered inaccessible due to groundwater. It was exactly what everyone had been hoping for, and then it vanished. Not the data, but the attention. The team presented preliminary findings at a small academic conference. A few images were shown, grainy scans overlaid with outlines. They described an underground structure of enormous size, and suggested that the layout could correspond with descriptions given by ancient sources. Their excitement was measured, scientific. They called for more study, for cautious optimism. But almost no one responded. No major excavation was launched. No large grant was awarded. No mainstream academic institution picked up the thread. Historians are still debating whether the silence that followed was due to academic inertia, or something more deliberate. The report was quietly filed. The press showed only a passing interest. Egypt's antiquities authorities did not announce plans for further work. And then something stranger happened. The Matahar expedition website where the scans were originally posted went offline. The link began redirecting to generic hosting pages. The report remained available in fragments, archived PDFs, copies uploaded by curious researchers, but no formal publication followed. And the team itself? They moved on. The lead researcher, Louis de Cordier, continued his work on sustainable architecture and deep time archives. In interviews, he occasionally mentioned the labyrinth, always in poetic terms, never in detail. One interviewer asked him directly, why was there no follow-up? His answer, the land is not ready. An odd phrase, evocative, frustrating, but perhaps not untrue. The discoveries made by the Matahar team were not definitive. They were suggestive, promising. They confirmed what had long been suspected, that beneath Hawara lies something structured, something large, something intentionally hidden. But without excavation, radar scans remain whispers. You cannot hold them. You cannot photograph them. You cannot prove them to those who do not wish to see. Still, those whispers linger. Other teams, inspired by the Matahar findings, have attempted similar scans in the years since. None have publicly claimed better results. Most have been refused permits or discouraged by logistical challenges. A few say privately that the data has been quietly suppressed, buried in bureaucracy, dismissed before it could be discussed. It's not that anyone is hiding the labyrinth, it's that no one is allowed to find it, at least not yet. There's a curious parallel here with the ancient myths. In many initiation stories, the hero is not permitted to see the whole truth until they've been tested, blinded, broken, or humbled. The knowledge waits, but only for those who can approach it without demand. Perhaps the labyrinth is performing its own test. It allows just enough to be seen, a satellite image here, a radar scan there, to pull us closer, but never enough to grasp, never enough to conquer. It is a mirror, and we are always catching only a glimpse of ourselves in it. An odd fact. In 2013, an encrypted hard drive surfaced online claiming to contain data from the 2008 expedition. It was posted anonymously with no explanation. A few tech-savvy enthusiasts attempted to decrypt it, but found only partial fragments, maps of uncertain scale, coordinates without labels, and what appeared to be a grid layout with rooms numbered 1 through 30. Some dismissed it as a hoax. Others said it matched descriptions from Herodotus more closely than it should. The file disappeared, and with it, perhaps, another piece of the puzzle, which leaves us with the enduring question, why hasn't anyone returned? The technology is better now. The water table is still high, but manageable. Funding could be raised. International teams would line up for the opportunity. Yet the silence remains. Perhaps it is the fear of what might be found. Not treasure, not sarcophagi, but knowledge. Knowledge that something we once called myth was real. That the ancients understood space, time, and consciousness in ways we have only begun to rediscover. That the labyrinth is not a ruin, but a resonance, a structure designed to endure not just through material, but through memory, through longing. The Belgian team found the edges of that memory, and they stopped. Whether by choice or by force, we may never know. But what they left behind, those ghostly scans, those numbered rooms, those quiet confirmations, are enough to remind us that beneath the sands of Hawara, the story isn't finished, it's just buried, for now. The debate hasn't ended, it's just changed its tone. The ancient labyrinth of Egypt, once considered more famous than the pyramids, remains one of history's most unresolved enigmas. It is at once a known place and an unknown one. A structure both described in detail and physically absent. Its name carries weight, yet its foundation remains elusive. So where does the theory stand today? Ask a room of historians, archaeologists and independent researchers the same question, and you'll receive a chorus of disagreement, cautious affirmations, and a few wry smiles. Because the labyrinth, in 2025, still refuses to fall neatly into any category. It is not mythology, not exactly. It is not confirmed archaeology, not yet. It is something in between, something that both invites scrutiny and eludes conclusion. Some scholars dismiss it entirely. They argue that Herodotus misunderstood what he saw, that the labyrinth he described was a mortuary temple complex adjacent to Amenemhat III's pyramid, that later writers simply embellished his account, layering on symbolic meanings that never existed, that the massive structure described by ancient authors was never real to begin with, just a series of mundane ruins filtered through the lens of wonder. In this reading, the labyrinth is a cautionary tale about trusting early sources. The ancients, after all, were not above exaggeration. They loved drama. They relished metaphor. Herodotus, in particular, has been accused of bending the truth to suit his themes. So perhaps the labyrinth was nothing more than a functional administrative centre with multiple rooms and symbolic carvings, impressive in its time, but far from a mystery. But that interpretation feels too neat, too dry, and it fails to explain the volume and consistency of ancient testimony. Herodotus, Strabo, Diodorus, Pliny, none of them described a modest temple. They described awe, confusion, grandeur, overwhelm, and each, in their own way, struggled to express the feeling of walking through a structure that disoriented, impressed, and ultimately resisted comprehension. More modern theories attempt to bridge the divide. Some Egyptologists acknowledge that while the original labyrinth may have been exaggerated, the scale of what once existed at Hawara was likely immense. They propose that the labyrinth included not only the main building described in ancient sources, but an entire support complex, temples, residences, storerooms, ritual chambers, perhaps even underground shrines. The lack of surviving architecture in this view is the result of flooding, stone removal, and millennia of erosion. Others go further. They suggest the labyrinth was a functional, even experimental architectural marvel, that it was used for complex rituals, astronomical alignments, acoustics, or even psychological transformation. That its very design, maze-like, mirrored and layered, was meant to impact the consciousness of those who walked it. Some speculate about resonance chambers, sound traps, or even spatial illusions built into the corridors. These ideas border on fringe territory, but they are increasingly supported by interdisciplinary researchers from fields like archaeoacoustics, geomancy, and ancient mathematics. Historians are still debating whether these concepts should be taken seriously. But even skeptics admit the labyrinth doesn't behave like a simple ruin, and then there's the cultural persistence of the idea. Long after the building vanished, the concept of the labyrinth spread like smoke across civilizations. The Greeks reimagined it in Knossos, turning it into a prison for a half-man beast. The Romans made it a symbol of the mind. The Christians adopted it into cathedrals, embedding labyrinths into stone floors as paths for penance and prayer. The medieval world saw it as a journey to God. The Renaissance saw it as a puzzle of reason. And the modern world, well, we're still circling. In a way, the labyrinth has achieved something most monuments never do. It has transcended its physical form. It has become a pattern of thought. An odd but telling fact. In a 2022 digital humanities project, researchers created an AI-powered reconstruction of the labyrinth based on all ancient descriptions and modern archaeological data. The result was not a final model, but a multiplicity of possibilities, a series of procedural maps that changed with each run. The team described it as a living simulation of uncertainty. They called the project Echoes of Hawara. How appropriate. Because at its core, the labyrinth has always been about echoes, not just architectural ones, but emotional ones. It's the echo of wonder in Herodotus's voice, the echo of frustration in Petrie's notes, the echo of a scanner's beep across the quiet sand, the echo of your own thoughts as you imagine walking through doors that no longer exist. And in today's academic world, that echo continues. No one denies the labyrinth mattered. No one denies something large once stood at Hawara. But no one agrees on what exactly it was. A tomb, a temple, a stage, a symbol, a machine. Maybe the reason we haven't found. The labyrinth isn't because we're looking in the wrong place. Maybe it's because we're asking the wrong question. We keep asking, where is it? But perhaps we should be asking, What kind of thing leaves behind only questions? And why does it keep calling us back? The desert has its own kind of silence. It's not just the absence of sound, but the presence of something older, something heavier, a stillness that feels aware. The sand at Hawara doesn't just cover stone, it covers time, it muffles memory, and it dares you to remember something that was never meant to be entirely found. The Egyptian labyrinth, whatever it was, however it once looked, now lives more in imagination than in excavation. A ghost of corridors, a blueprint of doubt. For centuries it has evaded our grasp, showing us just enough to keep us hungry, but never enough to satisfy. And perhaps that was its purpose all along. Because what kind of culture builds something so massive, so complex, so symbolically charged, and then erases it, or lets it be erased? Historians are still debating whether this was accidental or deliberate. The sand could have come naturally, winds shifting over generations, floods seeping into stone, a gradual decay of what once stood proud. Or perhaps the burial was intentional, a ritual closing, a sacred retreat. The Egyptians buried sacred items all the time, not to hide them, but to protect them, to preserve them from the corruption of time by withdrawing them from it. Maybe the labyrinth was buried like a scroll rolled tight, not destroyed, just unread. But the questions don't stop there. Why was so little written about it in Egyptian records? Why is it known almost exclusively through Greek and Roman lenses? Why, after all this time, has no formal excavation ever reached its heart? What does it mean to have a monument so well attested, and yet so absent? The answer perhaps lies not in the stones themselves, but in what they were meant to hold. If the labyrinth was indeed a spiritual space, a place of testing, transformation, ritual, or initiation, then it was never meant to be public. Its silence would have been part of its function, its vanishing an extension of its lesson. To walk the labyrinth was not to find something, it was to lose something, and in losing it, to understand. That may be why even now we keep circling it, in books, in documentaries, in idle thoughts before sleep. Not because we think we'll solve it, but because we sense that it was never a problem to be solved. It was an invitation, and it still is. An odd detail, just outside the ruins of Hawara, in a spot most tourists never see, there's a stone sitting half buried in the sand. Weathered, worn, no inscriptions, just a flat surface tilted slightly as if someone long ago had begun to carve a doorway and stopped. Maybe it was part of a larger structure, maybe it was just a fragment of rubble, or maybe, just maybe, it was a marker, not for a path, but for a pause. Because that's what the labyrinth really is now, not a monument, but a pause, a space in history where something immense once was, and still is, in the way it makes us wonder, in the way it reminds us that knowledge isn't always linear, that meaning isn't always in what is built, but sometimes in what is buried, and that sometimes the most enduring things are not those we find, but those we search for, endlessly. You can almost see it, can't you? The long, low halls, the flicker of torchlight on polished stone, the sound of footsteps echoing from nowhere, the smell of cool water and old limestone, a doorway, then another, then 12 more, and behind each one, not an answer, but a reflection, of you, still searching. You can rest now. The corridors are quiet. The sun has dropped behind the ridge, and the last echoes of wind have settled back into the dunes. The labyrinth sleeps again, not lost, not waiting, but simply being, beneath its shroud of time. Maybe it never wanted to be uncovered. Maybe it exists best like this, half remembered, half dreamt, held together by story and stillness. The ancient Egyptians understood that not all truths belong in the daylight. Some are meant to lie beneath the earth, wrapped in stone and silence, whispering only to those willing to walk slowly, to get lost, to listen. And tonight, you've done just that. You've followed the footsteps of travellers, scribes, dreamers and skeptics. You've stepped into chambers that no longer exist, turned corners carved from questions. You've remembered something the world tried to forget. Now, there is nothing more to do. No need to solve the maze. You're part of it now. So breathe deeply. Let your thoughts settle like sand. Let the edges blur, the torchlight fade, the halls dissolve. Let the weight of mystery wrap around you like a linen shroud, and sleep softly, like stone beneath stars, like memory beneath silence, like the labyrinth. Good night.